Well, let's get started. Welcome everybody to the, I think, first uh, DKU History Reading Seminar lecture. Uh, we have invited Dr. Dan Rodgers from Princeton to talk to us today about American politics. Let me first introduce Dr. Rodgers, and then I'll tell you where he came up in my time at DKU, just to give you an idea of how this all came together. Dr. Rodgers is the Henry Charles Leah Professor of History Emeritus. He taught from Princeton from 1980 to 2012. And he earned his Ph.D. in history from Yale University after graduating from Brown University. He's the author of 4 prize-winning books, including The Work Ethic in Industrial America, 1850 to 1920, Contested Truths, Keywords in American Politics, Atlantic Crossings, Social Politics in a Progressive Age, which has been translated into German and Chinese. And his most recent book is Age of Fracture, A History of Social Ideas and Arguments in America in the Last Quarter of the 20th Century, which was a co-winner of the Bancroft Prize. His articles touch on topics from American exceptionalism to the career of republicanism to the election of 2000. But it was his last book, Age of Fracture, which was where I came into contact with Dr. Rodgers, although he doesn't know that, because Age of Fracture was the textbook for one of our classes that we took at DKU. Unfortunately, I don't think any of my classmates are in the audience right now, but that's okay. Age of Fracture covers the intellectual history, but what that means is that he traces several strains of thought that begin in the 1970s and really the late 60s and the 70s and 80s, and he traces how these strains of thought develop into the present America. And so what we're hoping with this lecture is that he can, in a way, continue on that track and tell us how these thoughts have influenced beyond the writing of his book, which was in 2011, to the present situation of American politics. And so without any further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Dan Rodgers to talk about American politics.
Great, thank you, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here, wherever here is. I gather you folks are all over the globe, and virtual learning is what we do these days. But I'm delighted we can make this work. There's one more recent book that Henry mentioned, which is actually I mentioned only because it's coming out in Chinese sometime in the next year or so. A sermon called, in which the word "city on the hill" appears in American past, and it's an attempt to trace that through its presence in American politics. And I mention that not just because of the Chinese connection, but because you should know, and you probably did gather from the little introduction that Henry made, that I'm not a conventional political historian. I'm interested in political culture, and I'm interested in political ideas throughout all of American history. If you want to know something about voting blocks and this sort of thing in the recent American past, you have to talk to someone else. But political culture matters tremendously, I think, and political ideas matter tremendously. And so I want to use some of what I worked on in the book called Age of Fracture and bring it all the way to the present, all the way to the election that we're still in the midst of in the United States. In the book, I talk about fracture as a way of thinking about the world in which the force of society came to seem less important than the force of the individual. How the larger ways in which society shapes human beings and the larger ways in which human beings become human inside their social relationships gave way to understandings of self and society, in which the self became the most important thing, the self which chooses, the self which owns rights, the individual person. So it's a fracture of the terms in which people talked about themselves and their social relations. But today I want to talk about a fracture in the way that's a little closer to what the journalists are talking about, because fracture is the word of our current moment in the US. It's a moment of intense division, of distrust, of polarization, of anger, of fear. If you know, been following anything about the election of 2020, you know all this. And I wish I'd been able to patent the phrase age of fracture, because it's been used everywhere with a lot of reason. But I want to start by talking about what's true and what's also not true about the notion that the United States political system and political culture is more fractured now than it's ever been. I want to talk about various ways in which that is an exaggeration, come back to what's true about it, then try to apply it to what's happened since 2000 in American politics, and end up with some notion about where we are now. And this will all be speculative, and you'll ask good questions, which will push me to back up.
Thank you for coming to.
But I want, as I say, I want to start by talking about what's true and what's exaggerated in the notion of fracture. What did Donald Trump fracture when he burst into the presidency in 2016? And what was at stake in 2020? And where has its consequences left American politics? Some of what commentators mean by fracture is political polarization. Two parties intensely divided against each other, organizing themselves in ways that divide the politics into two. It's intense in contemporary America. Sociologists tell you you're much more likely to make friends with another person who shares your political ideas than you are on almost any other criteria. You're likely to know other people who share your political ideas and not know other people who don't. Fracture is intense, and it's not helpful in a democracy, and there it is. But it's also not new. It's true that the Constitution writers did not anticipate the party system that was to emerge in the United States. They imagined Americans operating outside of party. Even the Electoral College, as you probably know, is designed so that each state sends a group of wise persons to vote for the president, but not persons identified with party as far as they were concerned. But this notion that you can have a democracy without party did not last more than a generation. Even at the time of the revolution, the country was deeply divided between those who were in favor of the ratification of the Constitution and those who opposed the Constitution, thought of it as a new bid for power and tyranny on the part of elites. That same division became solidified into a party system with Thomas Jefferson in 1800 when he founded the Democratic Republican Party. And since 1800, the US political system has been dominated by two rival parties. Not a multi-party system, which is so common elsewhere. The United States system, as you all know, is a winner-take-all system. There are attempts to make third parties work in the American political system have never been successful. A number of complicated reasons for that. But the fact that it's polarized means that the contests are very, very intense, that the two parties operate by bringing out masses of their followers in political clubs and parades, mobilization, competition. This is the norm in American society. And the idea that political polarization is a new fact in American life is just simply historically wrong. This is true, and this is important, that the eras in which the intensity of that competition has diminished, we can find some of those in the American past. And the most recent one was the period in which your parents, if they lived in the United States, saw and experienced. That was the period between 1945 and 2000. It's a very unusual period in American political history. The Republican Party, which had been deeply, deeply opposed to the New Deal, thought of Franklin Roosevelt as a subverter of American liberties. After 1945, the Republican Party moved back for that position. It accepted massive amounts of the New Deal program. Even Ronald Reagan accepted massive amounts of the New Deal program and moved toward a more centrist position. On foreign affairs, there was a relative consensus that the United States needed to be a leader in the world. Exactly how that leadership was going to be organized was not always so clear, whether it was going to be with alliances, what kinds of alliances, but the idea that world leadership had fallen to the Americans to acquiesce in, that was shared by both parties. And there were moderate leaders at the head of both parties in the periods after 1945. And the most recent part of it, Bill Clinton, was a very avowed moderate. Both the Bushes were moderates. Joe Biden stands in that same tradition in his attempt to reach out to a political center. So there have been eras in which competition between parties has been less intense, but the familiar pattern, the longer pattern, is deeply intense partisanship. Intense identification with parties, exaggeration of party differences, and fierce contest to see which party will prevail. So in that sense, the age of fracture as a description of politics is somewhat misleading. We should be aware of that. Second thing that commentators talk about when they talk about the current fracture of American politics is the fracture of the media. The sources of information are now multiple, they're contested. People go here, there, they get different information everywhere they turn. And so not only do the sources of information fracture, but the very idea of truth itself, the argument goes, has been lost. You can find a truth most anywhere, and there is no more clear, objective truth to be found. Now, there's a lot of justification for this, and I'll come back to that later, but it's not as new as it seems. If you ran a newspaper in the 19th century, even in the late 18th century, you didn't run an outlet for objective news. You ran a personal, partisan paper. You were allied with one party or another party. You made it an opinion outlet for yourself and for those around you. And virtually every newspaper in the 19th century was identified very strongly with one or another of the political parties or political factions. And even when the newspapers began to consolidate into national chains in the 1890s, you may have heard of the name of Joseph Pulitzer or William Randolph Hearst. Those newspaper chains also were deeply, deeply partisan. And to get their readers, they worked that partisanship angle very, very intensely. So newspapers reveled in scandal. They reveled in exaggeration and fakery. That was all part of the way in which they tried to draw readers to their sheets instead of those on the opposite side. The media has been fractured from the very beginning of the print and media in the United States, and also in the early years of radio as well. Now, again, there's an interlude, and these are the things that we sometimes measure the current state of politics against. But the interlude, again, coincides with the period of relative moderation of the intensity of political competition, and that's in the early years of television. Everyone realized that at the beginning, the number of outlets for television was limited. You couldn't just start up a television station with national abilities to broadcast because the airwaves were limited. And the government allocated parts of the TV spectrum. And as a result, in the licensing system, because there were so few national outlets, they made each broadcaster agree to give equal time, as it was, the law said, equal time to differing points of view. And so on all the major national broadcasting systems, CBS, NBC, and the others, there was bipartisanship. You could hear both sides of the issues. And that prevailed from 1934 until 1987, when the federal government examined that decision decided that in fact, under the new technological requirements, the airwaves were not nearly as limited as they had been before, that it was now much easier through cable news to start up a new competing network. And so they eliminated the equal time doctrine. That was 1987. A decade later, Fox News appears on the American scene. It was the work not of an American, but of a highly political Australian English publisher, Murdoch. And he took the formula of politicized news that had been the common one in the print media and put it right onto the airwaves. Again, what draws viewers, just in the way what drew readers, was exaggeration. It was scandal. It was, in fact, outright falsehoods if they drew enough viewers, and very, very intensely partisan commentators. That turned out to be a great marketing scheme for Fox News and then later for others. And of course, in the new age of the internet, that's been exaggerated. Now, anyone can start essentially a media network. It works best if you find a niche on the extremes of where people will notice you, pay more attention. It's not a healthy system. Nobody thinks so. But the claim that truth has disappeared, I think, is wrong, not the way to look at it, if we're honest about it. Almost nobody on the airwaves these days or on the internet these days claims that they're a relativist, claims that anything is just as true as anything else. What they claim is that they're selling truth. They've got the real goods. They have the facts. All these outlets sell information that they claim is true. What they've done is to not destroy the idea of truth, but they've made truth into something saleable. They made truth into a commodity. They made truth into something you can choose, you can buy. Any flavor of truth you want, you can now get in the media universe. It's an intensification of an old pattern. So those are two very long-term threads of continuity. Not a long-term thread of continuity, it's the pattern of division between the two political parties in the United States, because their point of conflict has stayed remarkably stable since the writing of the Constitution. And that question is, how active should the federal government be? How much power should the federal government have? How much power should be left to states and to individuals? That was the issue that was at contest over the ratification of the Constitution. It was the issue that was at contest between Jefferson and Hamilton in the 1790s. It was the wedge issue during the New Deal. Big government on the one hand, small government on the other hand. And it's the conflict that's still being acted out right now, as we know, in the United States and elsewhere. Does the government have a right to require that you wear a mask in public? Or is mask wearing, should that be a matter of individual choice and freedom? That's another variation on arguments that Jefferson and Hamilton were having centuries ago. Now, you know American history, and you know that those are not the only issues that have come into the American political system and divided Americans. Slavery divided Americans intensely in the 1850s on different axes than the one that I've just described. And world affairs all the way through the 20th century has been a controversial subject, not necessarily about the fact that the United States should play a large role in world affairs, but how it should play that role. So the Vietnam War, the Iraq War were deeply contested issues. And moral issues have intruded into this system. Currently, the issue of over abortion and all the fierce contests over gender and family life that surround it. But the argument between large and small government, active big government, and governments that essentially confine themselves to the rights of individuals, that's been an enduring pattern, even as the parties have changed places on that. The Republican Party, from the Civil War when it was founded, up until the 1970s and 1980s, 1990s, was the party of both big business and big government. They wanted the government to enforce tariffs subsidies to help create and sustain a national economy. And the Democratic Party was the party of states' rights and weak federal government. The shift began in the New Deal when the Democrats took over as champions of big, active, socially conscious government. And the Republicans slowly became more and more the party of weaker government, of minimal regulation, of laissez-faire. So the parties have traded places quite abruptly at moments, but the long-term division remained. Even as it became less intense, as I've said, in the period after 1945, even when Democrats like Clinton and Obama consciously moved toward more market-friendly positions, and even as Republicans like Reagan and the Bushes embraced large parts of the New Deal, especially the Social Security Act. But the big division line in politics endured. It endured until the early part of this century, and then it fell apart. And that's where I want to move now to the political circumstance of the United States now and the election in which we're still engaged. It wasn't Trump that broke this pattern apart. It fell apart in the early years of the Obama administration, and a phenomenon that you probably know that called itself the Tea Party. And it sprang out of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. This was the political issue, the political crisis that Obama inherited. He became a president of the United States right in the middle of this financial crash. It looked like the beginning of another Great Depression, something as catastrophic as the 1930s Depression. And the Obama cabinet, the Obama secretaries of the Treasury and economic advisors decided very quickly that they had to bail out the banks and the largest corporations, or else the whole system would fall apart. They did other things too to try to protect ordinary Americans, but they thought the economic institutions that were too big to fail needed to be propped up first. And that triggered an eruption of anger among people who felt they'd been left out of the economic rescue package. Some of that anger came from the very top, commentators, Glenn Beck and others who railed against this use of federal power for the already rich and the already powerful. It also came out of the grassroots in very intense ways, in a movement full of anger, exaggeration, anguish. Conspiracy theories flourished all the way through the Tea Party system. They took the word Tea Party from the American Revolution. They imagined that they were doing exactly what the Patriots had done in Boston when they threw the tea that came with British duties off the wharfs of Boston. They imagined they were fighting tyranny. They were fighting the most abject form of despotism that they had seen come to America. But this time, they were not protesting a distant government. They were not anti-colonial revolutionaries. They were protesting the tyranny of their own government, as they put it. The tyranny of all the incumbent office holders, not just Democrats. They were against government. They were against the ways in which government, as they saw it, inherently used its power to suffocate the rights and liberties of individuals. Now, there have been strains of all this before in American history. There have been epidemics of conspiracy thinking. There have been anti-government revolts. There have been angry mass eruptions. This is true in all democratic politics. But this one had more lasting effects than many of its predecessors because it mobilized so much that was in the air at the time in 2008, 2009. It mobilized a sense of marginalization. When those social scientists who later went to interview Tea Party members, what they found themselves hearing was that those who had been drawn to the Tea Party thought that they were Americans who had suddenly become alienated from their own land. They were strangers in their own land. The government wasn't paying any attention to them. They were being left out of the media. They were being left out of the political, social contract, that their only way of reasserting their claim to be a part of the American system was in the anger of their protests. a country in which the gap between rich and poor had increased in the period since the 1970s. These were folks who, whether it was true or not, imagined themselves on the losing end of that growing exaggeration. They felt themselves globalized buffeted by global forces, by trade, which was moving jobs to China, by supply chains that was moving jobs everywhere. They were nationalists, and they thought the government ought to be paying attention to them. And then thirdly, they were racists, many of them, with Obama as the target of an intense racism whose intensity most Americans thought had disappeared in American politics, but had not. They were a grievance party. And normally this would have died out after it had accomplished some of its goals. But in this case, for reasons that nobody totally understood, the Tea Party revolt transformed the Republican Party. There were, in the wake of the Tea Party revolt, primary battles within the Republican Party, pitting the old centrists and moderates who had controlled the party against these new, much more intense and angry persons. It pitted those interested in economic stability and compromise and a smooth business climate against those who felt that the party needed to stand for outrage and needed to harness their outrage. And above all, needed to protect their rights as individuals who were being, as they saw it, crushed by forces that were far beyond their control, inside the United States and outside the United States. I give this much emphasis to the Tea Party because not only because it transformed the Republican constituency in the House of Representatives, but it made Donald Trump. I think it's clear to say that without the Tea Party revolt, without the angers that were mobilized in 2008, 2009, without its anti-governmental passions, without its furious sense of being forgotten in one's own country, there would be no Trump presidency. Now, I don't mean by that Trump was the necessary outcome of that upheaval of the Republican Party. There are all kinds of people trying to harness the energies of the Tea Party. And Trump was an accidental victor in all of this. He was an accidental victor in the sense that there were too many candidates in the Republican Party vying for the presidency. None of them were willing to step aside for the others. Each cannibalized on the others' votes. And Trump won out, not with a majority in the primary votes. He got only 45% of all the votes cast in the Republican primaries, but no one else came close. And it turned out there were reasons why he harnessed the energy of the Tea Party more effectively than any of the others. Most importantly, he was an outsider. You might say that in economic terms, he wasn't an outsider at all. He was a wealthy man. He had worked the levers of the economy and the levers of the government exceedingly well over the course of his career. But he posed himself as an outsider. He'd never been a part of any government whatsoever. He had never had any experience in government. He was going to come in and clear out the frame that the older and more complacent politicians had established. And he was not only an outsider to government, he was contemptuous of government as it was. He was contemptuous of its failures. He was contemptuous of what he called the deep state. All those bureaucrats that instead of working for the public interest were working for their own interest as he saw it. He harnessed, in that sense, precisely what the Tea Party members had felt in their bones. He was convinced that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had set the nation on a road to what he liked to call disaster. Disaster was his most important single word in the 2016 election. He was going to clean house. And he was deep into conspiracy thinking. So those who opposed his candidacy, he linked together in very complex, very intense forms of conspiracy, all trying to thwart the people's will. And Donald Trump posed himself as a man of the people in that sense. It was another quite extraordinary pose that he managed exceedingly well, one has to say. He was a rich man who talked like a taxi driver. He used incomplete sentences. He could not get to one end of a sentence to another with the same train of thought, but that's the way most Americans talk. It's the way most people talk all over the world. He was full of insults. He didn't censor anything that he said. The contrast with Barack Obama is really, really striking. Barack Obama's language soared. It was oratorical. It came out of the churches. Here was an African American speaking the language of the most edifying, celebratory sort. And there were Americans who found that very disturbing. They liked this guy who, as I say, talked just like a taxi driver. He seemed to speak to them. So he became not only an object of fascination, how this outsider could have broken into politics as he did, how he could speak so plainly their words of anger, but he became an object of identification, as we know, and of adulation. So a rock star of politics in a way that's rare in American history. You have to say that all this was much more important than any of policy provisions that Donald Trump stood for. There's something very vague and something very enigmatic about Donald Trump on the typical map of party positions. Was he for a big government or was he for a small government? Was he a kind of a New Dealer or was he another Goldwater? Well, he was both, and that was part of his appeal. On the one hand, he stood for very deep tax cuts. Now, especially for the rich and for the corporations, but also, at least at the beginning, he claimed he was for tax cuts for everybody. And he also stood for and consistently acted on a platform of rollback of regulations. Government would take less of your money. It would control less of the way in which you did your business and daily life. In that sense, he spoke for a tradition as old as the Thomas Jefferson and the Jefferson-Hamilton debate. But with a program of economic nationalism that wasn't like Jefferson at all. He was eager to give the government, federal government, enormous new powers. High tariffs, for example, which had not been a part of the Republican Party policy since the 1920s. Donald Trump brought them back as an economic tool, which he was eager to reinstitute in the American economic system. And he wielded those tariffs, as we all know, like a club in international economic warfare. So he was a big government person as far as tariff was concerned. He was a big government person as far as immigration policy was concerned. He wanted not just stricter immigration, he wanted a real wall, a big high border wall, which would be not only a symbol about who was inside and who was outside the American nation, but would be a symbol of the power of government to keep the nation's borders high, secure. He was for a very large infrastructure program, at least at the beginning, though that never got through the Congress itself. And he was for vigorous uses of executive powers. The power that Obama had been criticized for using so heavily by his Republican critics, the power of the presidency, which is not very well defined in the American system, to simply order things by what's called executive power. Donald Trump used that as vigorously as any president in American history. So you could say that the puzzling thing about Donald Trump was the incoherence of his policy. Try to map it on the typical patterns and it does not make any clear sense. But what I think was most important about Donald Trump was that policy was not the clue, not the key to his administration, or not the key to the man himself. He did promise economic growth. He promised and boasted about helping to bring down the unemployment rate. So there were people who could look to Donald Trump, and there still are people who look to Donald Trump as giving them something tangible. But equally important was the intangible, I think. He took a part of the population that felt economically insecure, that felt culturally besieged, that felt forgotten, and gave them something to believe in. And what they could believe in, Donald Trump told them, was that they were surrounded by enemies. They were surrounded by people who were trying to strip them of their rights and take away their guns and destroy their families and siphon off their tax dollars to pay for the welfare of somebody else, to pay for city folk and people of color. It's a phenomenon that I think we should call negative integration. You were joined together on the Trump side of politics by who you were against. You knew yourself by the enemies that you had. You were given unity by calling out your enemies. In an age of fracture, he let people feel that they belonged. He helped them feel unified. He helped reintegrate them. But it was a negative reintegration more than a positive reintegration because you were given worth and unity by who you were against. Now, there were two sides to the Trump administration, everybody knows. The inner policy of the Trump administration was to deal out extraordinary favors to business interests, to watch the economy grow as a result, and to take credit for that. It was a business-friendly government of a very intense sort, but the public-facing policy of the administration was to work the engines of resentment and keep those resentments focused elsewhere, to keep them focused on foreigners, on China, on European allies, on intellectual elites, on bureaucrats, criminals, the media, Democrats, immigrants. They were to help convince his supporters that they were surrounded on every side by enemies. Not unlike the populisms, the resentment-fueled populism that we see elsewhere in the present day in Eastern Europe and Latin America especially. And they spoke to people who felt lost in a more complicated world, buffeted by shifts in global trading patterns, factory closings, felt themselves buffeted by globally mobile capital, which closed their factories in overnight, by elites who seemed to scorn their religious beliefs and call them old-fashioned. Trump took threads from the American past in this way. He mixed them together with a new media system, and he brought all of this out of the margins in a new way into the political center. This was Trump's success. It was also the source of his failure. It's not clear that the voters in 2020 had political policy issues very foremost on their minds. They did in the election of 2018, where the issue of medical insurance was the key one in that contest. But in this case, though the Democrats tried to make a great deal of Trump's mishandling the coronavirus epidemic, there was an up or down vote, I think most observers agree, on Trump's style of leadership. Was it inspiring or was it crude and deeply alienating? Was it the work of a man whose impulses matched the needs of the people, or the work of a deeply ignorant man who didn't know what he was talking about or even cared to know what he was talking about, and who violated truth and the law with impunity? That was the issue in 2020. And Trump lost the presidency, or will soon lose the presidency. But the larger question for those of us interested in political culture is, even in losing, did he start a new realignment in American politics? Did he win even in a single term? And on the Republican side of the party system, the answer is clearly yes. The Republican Party of 2000, George W. Bush's party, is gone. It's been overturned and radically transformed. What does it stand for now? Does it stand for big government or small government? For the rule of law or the rule of presidential power? Does it stand for consistency and reasonableness, or does it stand for anger and anti-global resentment? What is its position toward the rest of the world? A new isolationism, not only from foreign wars, but also from foreign alliances? No one knows, but the pieces are not going to be put together on the Republican side of American politics very easily at all. Trump fractured all of its traditions and all of its political norms. And he got the adulation of many, many, many Republican voters in doing so. On the Democratic side, the election's important in a different way, though this one's less clear to me how it's going to turn out. Because in the election of 2020, the Republican Party had a temporary success in pasting the label of socialism onto policies that have very deep roots in the American past. Now, this was helped by Bernie Sanders, who said he was a socialist, though he was a pretty moderate socialist by the standards of most other countries outside the US. It was helped by the publicity that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez earned because she's such a media presence. And it's true that the programs that Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez advocated were similar to that of some of the democratic socialists in Europe. But there are also straight line links between their policy projects and earlier projects in American history. Pundits like to say, because they like to give equal time to both sides, that the Republican Party moved to the right and the Democrats moved to the right, and both parties have been taken over by the radicals. But the Democratic Party agenda of 2020 was not radical by the historical traditions in America. Progressive taxation of the rich, which was at the heart of the Sanders Project, is as old as taxation itself. It came with the very first taxation systems in the United States. And it was made explicitly a part of the constitutional power of the federal government in a constitutional amendment in 1913. Oversight of the police to make sure the police don't overstep their bounds. That goes deep, deep into the American past, back as far as policing itself. How much power do the police have to stop and search people on suspicion only? How much public revenue should go to the police and how much should go to jailing and prison systems? Those are very, very old issues in American politics. Major infrastructure investments have been a part of federal policy in the United States since the Civil War. Railroads, free public schooling has been a part of the American political system since the 19th century, including subsidies of college and vocational education, which again were part of the Sanders and Warren program. There have been energy policies and conservation policies since the New Deal. None of this is inherently radical or outside the American tradition. It's not to say that the policies of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party are necessarily the right ones, but the success of the Republican Party in putting the label socialist on them is a very, very important move and a new one. At least new since the, as I say, the kind of centrist movement of both parties in the post-World War II years. Because the move is not to condemn them as impractical or not to condemn them as misguided. It's to condemn them as foreign, alien, un-American. The move is to move the needle of what's centrally inside the historical traditions of politics in the United States and what's outside. And if it works, it will make Biden's attempt to find a new center to American politics futile. It will change the ideological pattern of modern politics. Because by branding this American tradition as outside, alien, threatening, foreign, it will make both parties now feel as if they're surrounded not just by rivals, not just by contestants with different policy visions of the United States, but by enemies. That may be, though this would be a worrisome outcome, the most worrisome outcome, that might be the lasting legacy of the Donald Trump interlude. A sense of politics as a warfare, a deep, deep warfare, not simply a vital contest. And if it does prevail, then the future of American politics is more stalemate, more intense polarization, and a new age of intense and enduring fracture. So let me leave it at that and see what questions I provoked from all of you on the Zoom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodgers. That was really interesting. I had never thought of the Republican Party as using socialism to define the Democrats as being somehow alien and non-American. But when because I guess for a lot of people that I know, especially at DKU, socialism isn't necessarily seen as like an automatic negative. And from the American history context, it would seem like socialism might be seen in the same light as like the uh, uh, the McCarthy era, and that sort of return to alienation and fear of foreignness is a very interesting note that I haven't seen really put out in a lot of the thinking that's been going on following the election. I'd like to take this opportunity to open up to questions. You can either place your question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand button. And I think there's a question in the chat right now. Is American originalism fundamentally anti-socialism?
Well, socialism is, of course, a hugely contested word. During the 19th century, with the arrival of what was labeled as democratic socialism in Europe, there was a lot of interplay between Americans and European democratic socialists, American progressives and European socialists. The big book, Atlantic Crossings, that Henry mentioned at the beginning of this hour, is all about those interconnections, about the cross-fertilization between New Dealers, progressives on the one hand, and democratic socialists and Labor Party figures in Europe on the other. What, of course, the revolution, first the Russian Revolution and then the Chinese Revolution, gave a whole different meaning to the word socialism. It gave it a revolutionary context that it didn't necessarily have in the democratic socialist politics. And it gave it sent a shudder through American politics that has lasted ever since. The sense that armed overturning of elites, confiscation of property, a complete overturning of the political and economic and social system was what socialism stood for. But that's been a nightmare among most American figures ever since 1917, 1919. But at the moment, the label is being used not for these purposes. Russia is never mentioned, and when people charge the Democrats with wanting to import socialist policies, China is almost never mentioned. What's mentioned is Castro and Venezuela. And it's used to argue that policies that would have been central to the New Deal are the same policies that we see in China and Venezuela. It's a very, very strange mix. So your question about is socialism antithetical to the American tradition or not depends utterly on how you're defining socialism and how you're using that as a political weapon in the contest.
I think we're waiting to make sure all the students can ask questions first. So if you're a student and you'd like to ask a question, please you can use the raise hand button, or if no one's speaking, you can just unmute and ask. There's a question in the chat: how to evaluate the existence of deep state to the writing of common history?
Well, deep state is a new term. It was invented by conservative commentators. The term before had been bureaucracies. And Max Weber and others had written about bureaucracies ever since the end of the 19th century. Their argument was that those who occupy the sort of civil service positions inside the government, they have interests of their own, which are not necessarily the interests of the public. They go by rules which are not necessarily democratically decided. They operate within a bureaucratic system. Is that true? Of course it's true. What intensified in the recent debate was not the claim that bureaucrats were not always responsive to the people, but the claim that they were in conspiracy, their overt conspiracy against the elected officials, and particularly against Trump himself. Is that true? I think there's no evidence to say that there is truth to that. Though clearly what fuels it is the times when Donald Trump and his cabinet appointees tried to change a policy which the bureaucrats thought illegal or deeply outside the norms, and then they were at odds.
All right, I'll recognize Haibe because she's had her hand up in the chat. If you want to get recognized, you can use the raise hand button as well. And then we'll move on to Aaron's question about Bernie Sanders as a possible way. But first, we'll start with Haibe.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Professor Rodgers. And I wish you could come to DKU after the pandemic. I'd like to ask a question about the public reaction to the election. If there were, what were the significant differences of the reactions by the public between the last presidential election and this election, just from your observation? Thank you.
So you're asking about the difference between this election and
the last election, the 4 years ago.
2016 and 2020. Okay. Well, I think in 2016, there was a great sense everywhere of uncertainty about what Donald Trump was going to do. He was a very ill-defined figure at this moment. But there were people, and I'll admit myself to be one of them, who thought, well, if he reaches out toward the center ground that he mapped out, a bigger infrastructure project, a tax cut that would be that would include most ordinary Americans, but exclude millionaires, as he originally promised. If he tried to shake up some of the bureaucratic inertia in American society, it might work out. And so there's a great sense of looking at the unknown and a pretty large sense of hopefulness. There's also a sense on the part of Democrats that Hillary Clinton had not been a very strong candidate for all kinds of complicated reasons, and that things would just see how things turned out. The 2020 election is very different as it has played out in the United States, because everybody knew what Donald Trump was and how he was going to govern, and so this vague figure on whom you could impose anything you wanted in 2016 was no longer vague at all in 2020. And that's why I think though that he mobilized such intense loyalty on the part of those who loved it, and he mobilized such intense dismay on the part of those who thought this was not the way they wanted presidents to act.
Thank you. We'll move to Aaron Flores' question about, is Bernie Sanders a possible way?
Anything's possible. I mean, all political systems are open to all kinds of disruption. That's part of the point that I've made. They have certain continuities, and yet they have moments of disruption. And Bernie Sanders was a moment of disruption. He really changed what the Democratic Party's policy was going to be moving forward. What Bill Clinton had stood for, which is free trade, global free trade. Obama had inherited that, and Hillary Clinton had inherited that. Bernie Sanders took off the Democratic Party agenda. There was going to be global trade, of course, but it was not going to assume that global trade in and of itself was going to make everybody more prosperous. Bernie Sanders also brought back the idea of progressive taxation with an intensity that hadn't been seen before in the Democratic Party. So he already is an answer in a way. He has changed things. He's changed the Democratic Party, as well as becoming a lightning rod for the Republican Party claim about socialism having taken over the party. My children are Sanders fans and think he would have won the election hands down. I think they're wrong. I think that in fact, what defeated Donald Trump was Donald Trump himself, and that the very blandness and the very gentleness and the very sort of slowness to anger that Joe Biden brought to the campaign was what attracted all kinds of people who would not necessarily identify themselves with Democratic policies into his votership. Whether he can succeed with this in the face of the intensity of debates that are going to go on in Congress, we'll see. But I think myself that Bernie Sanders is both the answer, but he would not have been a successful presidential candidate in 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Rodgers. We have a question from Professor Olsovsky to follow up on the question about Sanders.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Thanks for your illuminating lecture, Professor Rodgers. So yeah, following up on the Bernie Sanders question, what I was thinking is, the Trump phenomenon has also led to fractures in the Democratic Party itself and how to deal with Trump. And it seems that the Democratic Party itself is attuned to the analysis that you've laid out. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are constantly talking about bringing unity to the nation. So they're aware of the fractures. Maybe their analysis is not quite the same. But one thing you pointed out is that in doing so, at least in their rhetoric and in some of their policies, they probably have shifted a little bit to the right to appease and get some Republican voters who are disenchanted with Trump to vote for them as their electoral strategy, which, because it was a victory, it worked. But my wonder is, will that lead to a fracturing in the Democratic Party? For example, you see a huge fracture in the Labour Party in England over similar issues, whether they should be left or they should be centrist. And the epithet of the Democratic Party being socialist, which is absurd, has also forced the Democrats to basically avoid that rhetoric and distance themselves in some ways from Bernie Sanders. But at the same time, you have a Bernie Sanders kind of style of politics that is very popular. You have movements like Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of criticism of Biden as being too far to the right or even too close to corporate interests, these kinds of things. And so my question is the coalition, this is like speculating on the future, is the coalition that Biden managed to put together to win this election, the electoral coalition, do you think that's going to last? Because Trump has a movement behind him, and that movement got him the second most votes in US history, of course, and it's still strong ideologically in terms of its anger, the anger you described. So I was wondering, what do you think about the prospects for that party? You talked about the fractures in the Republicans, but what about the Democrats? Will it last, or will they have to change, or what do you think?
Well, it's a very, very important and complicated question, and I don't pretend to have a crystal ball on all of this. Certainly, is there going to be a fight in Congress over every piece of legislation if the Democrats have the ability to control both houses? There will be. Will there be a fight in the House of Representatives if the Senate stays with the Republicans? There will be, though it will be shaped very, very differently, because the idea of trying to force the clearly progressive legislation past the Republican Senate as it's now constituted that's a non-starter. So the context will make a lot of difference. I do think that the divisions between Sanders and Biden are no greater than the divisions that we've seen in the Democratic Party since the New Deal. There have been progressives, there have been more conservatives. In fact, in the 1940s, when the Democratic Party was so heavily dependent upon Southern voters, there was more difference inside the Democratic Party than there is now. The Democratic Party, in this wonderful book by Ira Katznelson, shows was the party of racial segregation and also the party of the New Deal. So I wouldn't exaggerate how broken or divided the Democratic Party is now. I'd also say that Biden has moved both to the right and to the left. His indictment of structural racism is something that we have not heard since LBJ, actually. His interest in dialing back on free trade agreements is a marked change to the left inside the Democratic Party. At the same time, as you say, he has moved to embrace a more moderate tone and probably, in the end, moderate business policies, with the exception of the environment, where he's going to continue what's been the main line. But so much will depend on what is politically possible. But the less that's politically possible, the more the Democratic Party will fracture. If they gain possibility of enacting something, they'll come together.
Thanks a lot. There's a lot that can happen, that's for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Rodgers. We've reached 10 o'clock. I would ask, do you have time for one more question?
Yes, sure.
All right. I want to introduce Rehan, who Rehan and I are the two U.S. history majors in the first class of DKU. And Rehan was my classmate in the class where we studied your book. So I'd like to introduce Rehan to ask his question.
Okay, hi, Professor. I'm Rehan from DKU. So we know that we read your book, Age of Fracture, last semester, and we learned a lot about the American intellectual history from your book. So I'm wondering that as a historian studying the intellectual history, could you kind of briefly introduce the area of intellectual history, like what we can study and why it's important to study the intellectual history? I think I'm very interested in this.
Sure, I'll have to give you the short answer rather than the longer one that I would do if we had time to talk about it. I build this lecture not as a repeat of the book. It'd be wonderful if you all wanted to read the book, but because I thought I would bring it closer to questions of political culture rather than intellectual history itself. But the two are tightly related in my mind, and this is the short answer I'll give. That what matters in politics, what matters in social life, what matters throughout a nation's history are the realms of what is conceived to be possible. And the realms of what are conceived of possible is actually a question of ideas. People act for things that they can imagine. They act for things that they can conceptualize. They fail to act when something it no longer seems to be intellectually plausible. And so shifts in major ideas are not just shifts in the ways in which intellectuals think, but they can be shifts in the very frames in which everyone thinks. And so what I tried to work out in the book that you and Henry wrote was the ways in which certain ideas about rights and certain ideas about society shifted, which do form, I think, some of the frame for what we see happening in the 2020 election. If you think of intellectual history as the story of intellectuals, fine, there's wonderful stuff to be done. But you can think about it as the story of the context in which all of us act. And then it seems to be even more powerful.
Okay, thank you.
Very much for attending. Well,
okay, fine.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, Dr. Rodgers, for giving us this lecture, and thank all of you for attending.
Okay, thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.